We continue now at the top of Daf Samech Aleph in Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 69a. On the previous summit, the Gemara was discussing Tumas Beis Habliya by the Nivlas of Tahar. When you have the nevel of a kosher bird, it creates Tumah. It's called Tumas Beis Habliya when it touches the inside of the throat. It's Metame Begadim as well. It's Metame the person's clothing as well. And the Gemara is discussing certain situations where, let's say, the Shechita or the Malika might be puzzle. It might be disqualified, but it is enough that it's no longer considered a nevel and it no longer has that Tumas Beis Habliya. And on the previous summit, there was a Machlokes Amoraim. Let's say a Zar does the Malika, a non-Kohen does the Malika. So in such a situation, it's not a kosher Malika. It's going to be disqualified. But again, the question is the Malika good enough that it's no longer going to have the Tumas Beis Habliya? Rabbi Yochanan says there is no Tumah. The Malika does in fact purify from Tumas Beis Habliya. And Rav says that it does not. Rav says there still is Tumas Beis Habliya in that situation. And the Gemara in the previous summit said that the Mishnah says, at the end of the Mishnah, there's a Zehaklal, a general rule. It says, Kol, anytime you have a situation of Psulo Bakodesh, and the Gemara says, we understand according to Rabbi Yochanan, that Kol is usually an inclusion, and it comes to include exactly this case. What the Mishnah is saying is, in a situation of a Zar, of a non-Kohen who does the Malika, so that's going to be a case where there's no Tumas Beis Habliya. But according to Rav, what is that Kol coming to include? And the Gemara now continues and says, V'letaimech, but according to your reasoning, you have this question on Rav. We can have another question on Rabbi Yochanan. What about the phrase Shalo Haya Psulo Bakodesh? It said in the Mishnah, any situation where the psul, the disqualification, was not in the Kodesh, Leisuye Mai, what is that coming to include? And so the Gemara says, Ella rather Reisha Leisuye, you can say that the first part of the Mishnah, the inclusion over there is coming to include Shchitas Kodshim Bifnim. Let's say the person slaughters Kodshim inside the Beis HaMikdash. In such a situation, that will be included as a case. It was not listed in the Mishnah, but that's going to be included as a case where there's no Tumas Beis Habliya. And Seifa, and then the end of the Mishnah, where we're including things where there is Tumas Beis Habliya, Leisuye Malikas Chulin Bachutz. That would come to include, let's say Malika is done on a non-sacred, a non-consecrated bird outside of the Mikdash. That was not mentioned in the Mishnah, and so that Malika essentially would do nothing. There still would be Tumas Beis Habliya, and we will mention over here that the general rule is that if the Malika was good enough that if it would go on the Mizbeach, it wouldn't come down from the Mizbeach, so that shows that there was something to this Malika. It was Chal in some sense, and then we would say, again, there's no Tumas Beis Habliya, but if it wasn't Chal in any sense, so then we would say that there is Tumas Beis Habliya. And the Gemara continues, Tanya Kivasi de Rabbi Yochanan. We have a brisa that supports Rabbi Yochanan. Milaka Zor, let's say a non-Kohen does the Malika. That's exactly the case. That's the machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yochanan and Rav. Or Milaka Apostle, or let's say somebody else who's disqualified does the Malika. And also you can have a case of Hapigul, Vahanosar, Vahatame. Let's say it's disqualified because it's Pigul or Nosar. It was past the proper time, or Tameh, it's Tameh. So all of those cases, even though there's a disqualification, Ein Mitam in Beis Habliya, there is no Tumas Beis Habliya in that situation. And so again, that brisa is like Rabbi Yochanan. Rashi explains, Hanosar v'hatameh. Now those psulim, those disqualifications come later. So Rashi says, V'lo amrina nafkilu meheter achilas kodshim. We don't say that now it's no longer permitted in terms of eating it as kodshim. V'chol alayu isr nevela l'mafreya. We don't say that the isr of nevela now retroactively is chal. That's the point of the brisa over here. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yitzchak says, Shamati, I heard. Shtayim, I heard two cases. Achas kemitzas zar. One case is a case where the zar does the kemitza. That's by a carbon mincha. He takes the fistful. The achas malikas zar. And then there was another case of the case we're discussing right now where the zar does malika on a bird carbon. And achas teired. The achas lo teired. I heard that in one of the cases, it has to come down from the mizbeach, meaning it's completely not effective. But the other case, lo teired, it doesn't come down from the Mizbeach. Once it goes on the Mizbeach, it stays on the Mizbeach. V'lo yadan, and I don't know which one. I don't know which is the one that stays on the Mizbeach and which is the one that comes down from the Mizbeach. And again, we already said above, according to Rabbi Yochanan and the brisa that supported Rabbi Yochanan, that in the case of a Zar doing Malika, so over there's no Tumas Beis Habliya, that would already indicate that it stays on the Mizbeach, and that's exactly what the Gemara says now. Amar Chizkiah says, Mistabra makes sense to say that Kemitza Teired, in the case of the Kemitza done by the non-Kohen, there it has to come down from the Mizbeach, but Malika, but again, when the Zar does the Malika, Lo Teired, it doesn't come down from the Mizbeach, again, following the same idea that the Malika is effective in some sense. The Gemara continues and asks, My Maishna Malika Diyeshna Babama, but what's the difference between the two cases? Why is it that Malika, we say, is considered to be somewhat effective? Because Malika exists by a Bama. Malika can be done by an altar that's outside of the Beis HaMikdash in the times of the Bamos. But Kmitza Nami Yeshna Babama, but when it comes to Kmitza as well, that also can be done by a Bama. So if you're going to say that that is the source to show that it is somewhat effective, the same logic should apply by the Kmitza. And if you're going to say Ein Mincha Bebama, you're going to say, well, there is no Karban Mincha by a Bama, so maybe it doesn't exist by a Bama. But then Ein Ofos Nami Bebama, but by the same logic, we would say there's no bird Karbanos by a Bama. The Amar Rav Sheshes, because Rav Sheshes said, L'divrei ha'omer yesh mincha bebama, according to the one who says there's mincha by a Bama, yesh ofos bebama, there's also bird Karbanos by a Bama. And L'divrei ha'omer ein mincha, and according to the one who says there's no mincha, so then ein ofos, there is no bird Karban, so you can't say that that's the distinction between the two cases. My time, and what's the reason for this? Because it's the same drasha. It says Zevachim in the pasuk v'lo menachos. It says Zevachim, and we understand that to mean Zevachim and not menachos. This is a pasuk. It says in the pasuk in Sefer Shemos, Vayizbechu Zevachim Shlamim LaHashem Parim. So we say not a mincha, and Zevachim v'lo ofos, and it says Zevachim, and we would also exclude ofos. We would exclude birds the same way. So that cannot be the answer to the question. And so the Gemara continues and says Elo'ema rather say as follows: Ein kiddush b'chli shares b'mincha b'bama. It is true again that by a bama there might be mincha, but there would not be sanctification in a kli shares by a mincha by a bama, and since that's excluded, so already mincha is not completely by bama the same way that it would be in the Beis HaMikdash, and that's why again over here by the Kmitza situation, Teireit, it would come down from the Mizbeach. Rashi explains the Yeshna Bebama, that it's by a Bama. Bizarre, again, we're talking about a non-Kohen doing it by a Bama. When we say over here that it's something that can be done by a Bama, we mean to say that it can be done by a non-Kohen by the Bama. L'divrei ha'omer b'perak achron, this is according to the one who says in the last parak, Rabbi Yehuda Omer ein mincha bebama. Rabbi Yehuda says no mincha by a Bama. Zvachim vayizbechu zvachim shlamim b'sinai, again, that's the pasuk. And so the Gemara ultimately said, ein kiddush kli shares b'mincha bebama. There's no sanctification in a kli shares by a mincha by a Bama. Hilkach lo yalfinan zar b'mikdash linyan kmitza mizar bebama. That's why we can't learn a non-Kohen doing by the Karban Mincha doing the kmitza in the Beis HaMikdash. You can't learn that from the non-Kohen doing it by the Bama. The lo dami hach kmitza lahach kmitza, because this kmitza is not the same as that kmitza. The v'mikdash hoel v'kidsha b'chli shares ifsala bizar. We can argue that in the Beis HaMikdash where you're sanctifying it in a kli shares, which you don't have by the Bama, so there it is going to be disqualified with a zar. It will be disqualified with a non-Kohen. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, Molak bismol o belayla. It said if the malika is done with the left hand, or if the malika is done at night. And in those cases, the Mishnah said again that it's ein metamin b'beis habliya. There is no tumas beis habliya. It does have some effect essentially. The Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Yachol te malika shi lifnim, mitame begadim b'beis habliya. One might think that malika, which is lifnim, which is done inside the azara, one might think that that's mitame begadim in the beis habliya. Talmud lomar nevela. The pasuk says nevela. The Gemara says Hanami nevela. This also might be nevela. What exactly are we learning from this pasuk of nevela? Taking a look at the full pasuk, the pasuk says V'chol nefesh asher tochal nevela utreifa bo ezrach uvager v'chibes begadav v'rochatz b'mayim v'tamei ado erev v'toher. We'll see Rashi in a moment, but this pasuk is talking about tumas beis habliya. It mentions nevela utreifa. So from the word nevela, the Brisa doesn't understand how you would derive anything. Ella rather Talmud lomar treifa. It's rather from the fact that the pasuk says the word treifa, and we learn as follows: Ma treifa she'in materes eso iser. Just like treifa is not mater, it doesn't cause something prohibited to be permitted. Af kol she'in materes eso iser. So too, when we talk about this tumas beis habliya by the nevela of the oaf, it has to be a situation where something prohibited does not become permitted. Yasam malika shehi lefnim, that would exclude a case of malika that's done inside the azara. Hoel v'hi materes eso iser, since that's the kind of malika that can permit what is prohibited, so ein metame begadim b'beis habliya. So that's why it's not going to be metame begadim b'beis habliya, meaning again it is going to be effective to that degree. And Rashi explains, Hachi garsinan b'toras kohanim lach masnisa yachol te malika shilifnim metama hanami nevela. He first, the Brisa tried to learn it from the word nevela, and the Brisa said, what does that mean? This also might be nevela, as Rashi explains. Man leimalach delav nevela. Who says that this is not nevela? Nehi dehutra malikas chatas ha'of lekohanim migzeres hakasef. And Rashi explains, we understand that when you do a malika on a chatas ha'of, so there the kohanim are allowed to eat the meat. The whole question over here is the malika permitting that which is prohibited, meaning allowing it to be eaten. So we understand that the malika by a bird chatas, that we know the pasuk says that the kohanim eat the meat. So the malika is causing that to be permitted. Milachol chatosam, that's again from the pasuk. Kediamron beperek Beis Shammai, we said that earlier. But what about ola? The question over here in the Brisa, says Rashi, is focusing specifically on a carbon ola in ola sa'of, a bird carbon ola, which is not eaten. Shelo hutra lehem titma bebeis habliya. So there they're not eating it. It's not creating any permission to eat the meat. So maybe there should be tuma bebeis habliya. And again, the Brisa said you're going to try to learn from nevela, but it's no proof. Maybe this is also considered a nevela. You did the malika on this bird, and nothing is going to be eaten, and so maybe it's also considered nevela. And the Gemara then said, the Brisa then said, El Talmud lomar treifa. Rather, we're really learning from the word treifa. V'nefesh asher tochal nevela utreifa. It says in the pasuk that the nefesh, that's the pasuk we just saw, the person that eats the nevela or treifa, again it says v'chibes begadav, indicating that there's going to be tumah that will make the begadim tamei as well. Uvenivlas oftar mesukma kra b'toras kohanim. The pasuk, we understand the pasuk to be talking about our case of a nevela of a kosher bird. V'hai treifa kra yiseruhu l'drasha. The word treifa in this pasuk is an extra word, and it's there for a drasha, kedelakamon, as we'll say later on. She'efshar l'shomo kimashmo. You can't understand it just by the simple understanding of the pasuk. She'yehei treifa metame bebeis habliya mechayim. You can't say that it means that a treifa is tamei in the beis habliya when it's still alive, while the bird is still alive. But a treifa means it has a mortal wound that may cause it to die. Now, im treifa chay, you certainly can't say that if a treifa lives. We'll see as the Gemara goes on. The Gemara will discuss different possibilities. Is a treifa able to live or not? V'im eina chay, and let's say you're going to say a treifa is not able to live. So harei bechlal nevela, but that would be the same as nevela, so it would still be an extra word. V'hamas nisu lakamei misukam k'Ravi Meir. Rashi says we're going to say that this Brisa is following Ravi Meir later on. The islay shchitas oftar mitaheres treifaso mitomasa. What happens if you have a situation of a slaughtering of a kosher bird, but that bird happens to be a treifa? So over there, in that situation, do we say that the tumah, that there is no tumas nivlas of tahar? So we're going to say that it follows Rabbi Meir that yes, it's mitayer. When you slaughter that oftar, that is a treifa, it does not have that tumah. V'lo dorish lei lahai kra lahavi treifa sheshachta shetitma. And so therefore, we're not using this pasuk to say that a treifa that's slaughtered is tameh. Hilkach. So therefore, dorish lei lemuute maliko. Instead, we're going to use this pasuk to darshan as an exclusion of malika shehi befnim. Let's say you do a malika, any malika that's done inside the mikdash. Again, even here by the ola, where it's not permitting anything to be eaten, ushchita shehi lefnim, or let's say slaughtering that happens inside the azara, umashmalei krahachi, and the pasuk means to say as follows: nevela shehi ketreifa hi demetama. The only time the nevela of an oftar is going to be tamei is if it is like a treifa. And what does that mean? Ma treifa ain't treifas hamaura ba mater shum iser. The fact that it's treif is not going. The fact that it's a treifa doesn't permit anything that's prohibited. Shaya ba mitchila. It's not going to permit anything that would have been prohibited. So af nevela. So too when we talk about nevela and tumas nevela. She'ein nevelas hamaores ba mater eso iser. It has to be a situation where the nevela is not permitting that which is prohibited. Yotza nevelos. Now that comes to exclude our case. Let's say you have an animal that became a nevela. Habola al yedei malikas penim. But how did it become a nevela? How did the bird die? It died through a malika that was done in the azara. Behechsher, and that malika was done the proper way. Hoel umater eso iser shebechayel lo haisa ruuya lekarev legavoa. What's the heter over here? It's prohibiting that which was prohibited, because while it was alive, you can't offer it as a carbon. V'hutra b'malika zu, and this malika is creating some kind of permission. Maybe it's not creating a permission for the kohanim to eat it, but it's allowing it to be offered. That's called materes eso iser, and therefore again malika that is lifnim, it's materes eso iser. So we say ein mitame begadim bebeis habliya. And the Gemara continues, Hevi hamolek kachim bachutz, and we're also going to include a situation of, let's say, a malika is done on a bird that is kodesh, on a bird that was sanctified outside the azara, umolek chulin bein mi bifnim, bein mi bachutz, and also, let's say, malika is done on an animal that was not consecrated, and that's whether it was done in the azara, whether it was done outside the azara. Hoil ve'ein matir neso iser. So since in those cases you have a situation where nothing is prohibited is being permitted, so then in those cases, metam and begadim abeis habliya. So then in those situations, there actually will be tumah of the begadim due to the beis habliya. Again, in those situations of molek kachim bachutz or molek chulin bein mi bifnim bein mi bachutz, in both of those situations, nothing is being permitted through that malika, and therefore, since nothing is being permitted, so therefore we say that there is tumas begadim in a situation of beis habliya. And the Gemara continues, Tanyu Idach, we learned in another brisa, Yachol te shchitas chulin lifnim. One might think, let's say, chulin, again, you have a situation where the bird is chulin, it was not sanctified and it's slaughtered. In this case, we're not talking about malika, we're talking about shchita. It's slaughtered in the azara. V'kadshim, or let's say it was sanctified, bein mi bifnim u bein mi bachutz, then it doesn't matter if that happened in the azara or outside the azara. One might think, mitame abeis habliya. One might think that there you do have tumas beis habliya in these situations. Talmud lomar nevela. Again, the brisa brings the pasuk of nevela, and again the brisa says, the Gemara says, Hanami nevela. This also is nevela. What does that mean? Maybe this is also nevela. That pasuk wouldn't teach us anything. Ela Talmud lomar treifa. Rather, again, it's because the pasuk says treifa. That's how we learn these cases. And over here, the drasha goes as follows: Ma treifa shava bifnim kibachutz. Just like treifa is the same inside, meaning inside the azara, it's the same inside the azara as outside the azara. Afkol shavos bifnim kibachutz. So too, it has to be cases where it's the same inside as it is outside, and that excludes our cases. Yotza shchitas chulin bifnim. That comes to exclude slaughtering chulin inside the azara. V'kachim bein mi bifnim bein mi bachutz, or kachim in or out of the azara. Hoel v'lo shavu bifnim kebachutz. Since bifnim and bachutz are not the same in these cases, so then we say ein mitam and begadim abeis habliya. We say there is no tumas begadim abeis habliya in these cases. And Rashi explains, Yachol te shchita shi lifnim. One might think that slaughtering that happens in the azara, uvetoras kohanim garsinan lahachi. In Toras Kohanim, the gear says as follows: Yachol hashochit chulin bifnim. One might think if one slaughters chulin inside the azara, the kachim bein mi bifnim bein mi bachutz, or kachim whether in or out of the azara. Again, talking about birds. Hanami nevelahi. So first the brisa brought the pasuk of nevela, but this is also nevela, meaning again miyemar delav nevela nevelahi. Who says this is not nevela? Because since there is no such thing as slaughtering a bird inside the azara, you're supposed to do malika. V'chein bekachim, in the same by a consecrated bird, bein bifnim, bein bachutz, whether inside or outside. Again, shchita is not really relevant, so maybe it is nevela. And so again, the brisa says, Talmud lomar treifa. The brisa meant to say, it says the word treifa, kilomar nevela shehi ketreifa mitama, meaning only if the nevela is similar to treifa is there that tumas beis habliya. And what does that mean? Because by treifa, sheshavos bifnim kebachutz, by treifa, inside is the same as outside, which means the kan v'kan hi asura, meaning it's asur in both situations, inside and outside. Hachi garsin on yotza hashochit chulin bifnim v'kachim bein bifnim bein bachutz hoel v'lo shavu bifnim kebachutz ein mitam. And the point is to exclude again slaughtering chulin inside or kachim whether inside or outside, because there you don't have that equivalence between inside and outside. Well, the kamon mefarish v'yazal. As the Gemara now goes on, the Gemara will explain what this means. And the Gemara continues and explains, Bishlama chulin. Now I understand the case of chulin. That's the case where a chulin bird is slaughtered in the azara. That I understand. Lo shavu bifnim kevachutz. I understand that the inside is not the same as the outside. And Rashi explains, Bishlama chulin shavsa shchitasan bifnim kevachutz. It means as follows: Shaharei chulin shechutin bachutz. When you have a situation of a bird, let's say a bird is just shechted outside of the azara, a regular case of chulin. So there, of course, ein mitamin. There, of course, we're going to say there is no tumah because that's a perfectly acceptable shchita. The person is slaughtering the bird in order to eat the bird. V'afilu shelo b'hechshero. And Rashi says this would actually be true even if it was slaughtered, if the chulin was slaughtered outside the azara in a situation where it's not allowing the bird to be eaten. How could you have such a case? Could go an of treifa shashachta. Let's say you would have, for example, the bird was a treifa, so it had a mortal wound, so it's not going to be kosher to eat, and then you slaughter it. So there also we say that there is no tumas tumah of nivlas oftar in that case. And how do we know that? Hamas nisan lekamon Rabbi Meir, because we're going to say again, it's later on. We're going to say this is following Rabbi Meir to mitaher treifas ha'of shchuta, who says that in a situation where the oaf is a treifa and it's slaughtered, it's considered tar in that case. Umuki treifa dechsib bekra lahachdrasha lemuute pnim, and he says that the word treifa that's written in this pasuk is for this drasha that excludes when it happens inside. And Rashi over here is referencing the same drasha that Rashi mentioned above. Again, Rashi said above that according to Rabbi Meir, hilkach dorish leilemuute malika shi befnim ushchita shi lefnim. Again, that was going on the earlier brisa that this pasuk is used to exclude malika that happens inside the azara, shchita that happens inside the azara. That in these cases, again, there is no tumas beis habliya. And in any case, the point over here in the Gemara is that by chulin we understand bachutz and befnim are not shavu, because if you have shchita of the bird bachutz, so that's a good shchita, and that's going to be metaret. There's going to be no tum over there of tumas beis habliya, and so therefore befnim as well. We're going to say that in this situation, since lo shavu befnim kevachutz, so ein metamin begadim a beis habliya. We understand what it means by chulin, but the Gemara says ela kachim. But when it comes to kachim, talking about slaughtering a bird that was consecrated either in the azara or outside the azara, so what does that mean that it's lo shavu bifnim kibachutz? It's exactly the same. Idi v'idi psulin ninu. In both cases, that's disqualified because you have a consecrated bird. What's supposed to be done is malika and not shchita. And the Gemara continues and says, Amar Rava says, Im hoila lo shchitas chutz lechayvo kares. In the case of slaughtering it outside of the azara, so there the shchita is effective in some ways because it's considered shchitas chutz, and the person is chayv kares for slaughtering it outside of the azara. So lo toa lo letara midei nevela. So shouldn't that also be enough? You see that the shchita is able to do something, and so therefore shouldn't that be enough also to purify it from nevela? And so that's why shchita chutz, we can understand over there why there's no tumas nevela, why there's no tumah beis habliya. And so then the Gemara says eshkechon chutz. Okay, so that explains if it's slaughtered outside the azara, penim minolan. How do we know if it's slaughtered also in the azara? And that's for the same logic. Hoel v'lo shavu bifnim kevachutz. Because again, if bifnim is not the same as bachutz, that we can't have. And so therefore, since bachutz we say that it's tahar, so also in the situation of bifnim, we're going to say that it is tahar. But the Gemara continues and asks, if so, mola kachim bachutz namilo. Let's say you have a situation of malika done to a bird that is kodesh, a bird that was consecrated, and that malika is done outside the azara. There should be no tumas beis habliya. The lo shavu bifnim kevachutz, because bifnim is not the same as bachutz. We know that the malika is going to be effective to purify it bifnim, and so therefore we should argue that bachutz as well it should purify. But that's not true. By the mola kachim bachutz case, we say that it is metame bebeis habliya, and the Gemara says to that, Omar Rav Shimi Barashi says, Donin davar shelo bechshero mi davar shelo bechshero. We learn something done not in the kosher way from something that's done not in the kosher way. Vein donin davar shelo bechshero mi davar shebechshero. You can't learn something shelo bechshero from bechshero, meaning to say you can't learn malikas kachim bachutz, which is done not behechsher. Malika is not supposed to be done outside the azara. You can't derive that from a case of malika that's done in the azara, because that's being done in the perfectly acceptable way. Malika is supposed to be done bifnim. That's why you can't learn malika bachutz from malika bifnim. But the Gemara says velo, but is that not really true? Can you not learn something shelo bechshero from something bechshero? Vatanya, but we learned in a brisa, minayin liyotze. From where do we know in a situation of yotze when it leaves the proper area? Shim olo lo yered, that let's say you have something that was yotze, it left the proper area, but once it goes on the mizbeach, we don't take it down from the mizbeach. What's the source for that? Shaharei yotze kosher bebama, because yotze is kosher by a bama, by an altar that's outside of the Beis Hamikdash. In the times of the bamos, yotze was kosher, and therefore yotze in general we say ala lo yered. And wouldn't this be an example of learning something behechshero from something lo behechshero? Bama is a situation of behechshero. That's when bamas were allowed, and now we're learning into a situation of yotze, which is lo behechshero. So you see, you are able to learn something shelo behechshero from something behechshero. And the Gemara says to that, the Tana of this brisa was actually not learning from Bama. That's actually not the real source. Azos Toras Ha'ola Riba Samachle. The Tana of this brisa was really learning from the pasuk Zos Toras Ha'ola. We learn from Ha'ola that it goes up, that which goes up on the Mizbeach does not come down from the Mizbeach. And Rashi explains, Idi v'idi, again, the Gemara asked by Kachim, whether it's bifnim or bachutz, it's the same. Bein bifnim, bein bachutz, nevela zu, shava bahem, she'en kan Torah shchita. If you're talking about a bird that was consecrated, there is no idea of slaughtering such a bird, so shouldn't bachutz and bifnim be the same? And Amar Rava, then Rava said, shchitas pnim dechulin, hu denafkalon mehach drasha. Slaughtering pnim, slaughtering it inside, by chulin we learn from the drasha, meaning to say this drasha of treifa, really that is just for the case of chulin that we just had above. Again, the situation where the chulin was slaughtered inside the azara, we say it's treated the same as chulin slaughtered outside the azara, and we say there's no tumas beis habliya. Avol kachim lo tzarich lemelaf mina, but kachim you actually don't need to learn from that pasuk. The memela nafkalon de lo metamu ofos kachim shchutin bachutz, because we're going to know anyway, automatically we know that if you have birds that are kachim that are slaughtered outside the azara, we know there's not going to be that tumah. Because we can make the following argument: since slaughtering it outside the azara, there's a chi of kares mishum shchutei chutz. You're actually chi of kares for slaughtering outside the proper place. We're going to see that later on in Perak HaShochit v'Hamalo. Me'o asher yishchat l'rabo shchita sof comes to include slaughtering the bird, even though normally malika is done, but even shchita sof is going to give kares. Alma shchita yishma. You see that it's called shchita. So lo toel bitmiya, the Gemara is asking it as a bitmiya, almost like a rhetorical question. Should we not say then, if it's enough to get kares, shouldn't it be enough to be mitaret from this tumas nevela, from the tumas beis habliya? And Rashi continues, Hachi Garsinan, this is the proper text, Eshkechon chutz. So again, we find by chutz we can make this argument, since the shchita of this bird, which is kodesh bachutz, is enough to give kares for shchutei chutz. So then again, you can make this argument that it's enough of a shchita to be mitar, that there's no tumas beis habliya. But panim minolan, how do you know this applies? If you shech the consecrated bird inside the azara, that it doesn't have the tumas beis habliya. Umeshani, and the Gemara answers, hoel v'lo shavos bifnim kebachutz, because then the inside would not be the same as the outside. Again, do kimno devachutz lo mitami, because we just said that bachutz there is no tumah. We said that shchita is enough to be mitar. Even though in terms of eating we're going to say it's asur, it's a bird that's kodesh, so shchita doesn't work on such a bird in order to permit it to be eaten. But betuma miyalo shava, but in terms of tumah, it's not going to be the same, and we're essentially saying it does have to be the same. And so therefore we're saying, just like when it comes to chutz we say that it's pure, so too in a situation of shechting the consecrated bird inside the azara, we're going to say that it is pure. And then the Gemara asked, Yachi, if so, molak kodshim, what about a case of malika done on kodshim to gatani le'el mitamin? We said that if you have malika on kodshim, we said before that it does not purify it. We said it's tameh, and that was talking about in a situation of malika of kodshim that's done outside. So halo shava b'chutz kebifnim. Their chutz is not the same as bifnim. To ha bifnim hechshiro b'malika, because bifnim, there the malika is actually what permits it. The malika is supposed to be done bifnim, and so therefore molak kodshim b'chutz, we should apply the same argument, and we should say that it's tar in that case as well. And the Gemara said to that, don in davar shelo behechshero, something that's not behechshero, meaning shchitas kodshim bifnim. Let's say you're learning shchitas kodshim bifnim, which is not done properly. Malika is supposed to be done midavar shelo behechshero, so you can learn something shelo behechshero from something else shelo behechshero. You learn shchitas kodshim bifnim from shchitas kodshim bachutz, from the case of shchitas kodshim bachutz. V'chein shchitas chulin bifnim mishchitas chulin treva bachutz. You can also learn shchitas chulin bifnim. Let's say you shecht an animal that was not consecrated inside the azara. You can learn that out from a case of shchitas chulin, even if that chulin was treifa bachutz. We can learn out those cases one to the other. We can say again that in these cases there's not going to be that tumas beis habliya. However, ve'ein don in davar shelo behechshero, you can't learn something not done properly. Could go in malikas kodshim bachutz, like the case we're talking about now, malika done by kodshim bachutz. You can't learn that midavar shebehechshero, from something being done properly, which is malikas kodshim bifnim. You're supposed to do malika on kodshim bifnim. The Gemara then said, is that really true that you can't learn a davar shelo behechshero from something behechshero? The Gemara tried to bring a brisa that shows not like that, but ultimately the Gemara said that brisa really is using a different source. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Molak v'nimtzas treifa. Let's say the malika is done, and it turns out that the animal is a treifa. This is the case that Rashi mentioned earlier. So here Rabbi Meir says, Eino metame bebeis habliya. Even though it turned out this animal was a treifa, but still the malika is enough to say that it is not considered an avela in terms of tumas beis habliya. There is no tumma. Rabbi Meir Omer says, Rashi, Eino metame bekal v'chomer. We're about to say the kal v'chomer that Rabbi Meir makes, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Samech Tes Amid Beis.